Stop scrolling for a second. I need you to actually hear this one. At 3:53 in the morning, back on June 3rd, the ground 40 miles off the coast near Eureka let go with a 5.7. Most people never felt it. 12 minutes later, a 5.1 hit closer to shore. Then a 4.5, then a 2.8, then a 3.9. 4 earthquakes, one morning, one stretch of coastline. And that was just the loudest day in a pattern that has not actually stopped since. 2 months before that, on the other side of Northern California, the ground under a geothermal field called the geysers did something similar. Dozens of small quakes swarming in place. No main shock, no aftershock sequence, just tremor after tremor stacking, up in the same 6-mile patch of earth. Same week, 40 miles south, near a town called Aromas, the ground did it again. And about 300 miles to the southeast, underneath a place most people only know as a ski town, Mammoth Lakes. The earth has been doing something even stranger. It spent nearly 50 years slowly rising, 2.5 feet since 1978. And sometime in the last couple of years, without any dramatic earthquake to mark the moment, it quietly started sinking instead. None of these things, by themselves, are the story. I want to be straight with you about that right up front, because I'm not in the business of telling you the sky is falling when it isn't. USGS still has every volcano in California sitting at normal, green code, background levels. As of this week, nobody is predicting an eruption. Nobody is predicting the big one on a specific date, because that's not how any of this works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But here's what I'm telling you. Northern California sits on top of one of the most geologically busy junctions in North America. And right now, in the summer of 2026, 3 separate systems that don't normally talk to each other are all showing activity in the same stretch of months. A tectonic swarm offshore, a geothermal swarm inland, and a supervolcano's caldera floor doing something it hasn't done in this configuration in years. I've spent the last week going through USGS data, geodetic surveys, and swarm catalogs to figure out whether these are connected, what's actually different about each one, and what it means for the people living on top of all of it. So let's break it down properly, region by region, system by system, because if you live anywhere from the Bay Area up through the Cascades, you need the real picture, not the headline version. Before we get into what's happening right now, you need to understand why Northern California is basically ground zero for this kind of activity in the first place, because this isn't a random spot that happens to shake sometimes. Northern California sits on top of something called the Mendocino Triple Junction. That's the point, just offshore from Cape Mendocino, where 3 tectonic plates meet at once: the Pacific Plate, the North American Plate, and the small aggressive little Gorda Plate that's getting squeezed and shredded between the 2 bigger ones. Triple junctions are inherently unstable geologic features. There is no clean, simple boundary there. It's a mess of faults, fractures, and stress fields all fighting for space, and that's exactly why that stretch of coast produces so many earthquakes, including some of the largest in California history. Move inland and you hit the geysers, the largest geothermal field on the planet, where superheated fluids and steam are constantly moving through fractured rock, some of it naturally, some of it because we've spent 60 years injecting water down there to generate power. That fluid movement itself creates small earthquakes almost daily. Most days nobody notices. Some days it clusters into a swarm. Keep going east, and you're in the shadow of the Cascade Volcanic Arc. Mount Shasta and Lassen Peak, California's 2 most dangerous volcanoes by USGS threat ranking, both still capable of eruption, both currently quiet. And then southeast of all of that, out past the Sierra Crest, you hit Long Valley Caldera, a 200 square mile crater left behind by an eruption, $760,000. Years ago, so large it buried much of the western United States in ash. Long Valley isn't dormant. It's restless. It's been restless since 1978, and it is one of the most closely watched volcanic systems in the country for exactly that reason. So when I say something is changing beneath Northern California, I'm not talking about one fault or one volcano. I'm talking about a region where 4 fundamentally different geologic systems, a triple junction, a geothermal field, a volcanic arc, and an actual caldera, all sit within a few hundred miles of each other. And this year, in overlapping windows, all 4 have shown you something. I want to walk you through this the way I'd walk you through a multi-day severe weather setup, because that's genuinely the clearest way to see the pattern. This isn't one event, it's a sequence, and the sequence matters more than any single day in it. January into February, San Ramon. Out in the East Bay, near a town called San Ramon, the ground started swarming. No major volcano anywhere near it. USGS was direct about that. The nearest volcanic rock in that area is 5 to 8 million years old and stone cold dead. This was purely tectonic, stress building along one of the smaller fault strands in the Bay Area's fault network and releasing itself in dozens of small quakes rather than one large one. On its own, unremarkable. But it's the first domino in a year that would end up being unusually active across the whole region. March 19th and 20th. The geysers and aromas. Within about 20 minutes of each other, two swarms lit up almost 90 miles apart. A magnitude 2.3 near aromas, shallow, just over a kilometer deep. A magnitude 2.4 at the geysers, 3 kilometers deep, followed by a whole tail of smaller tremors between magnitude 1.0 and 2.0. Now, geysers swarms happen constantly. It's one of the most seismically active patches of ground in the state, purely because of the geothermal operation there. But the timing, stacked right on top of a separate swarm 90 miles away, is the kind of coincidence that makes seismologists start pulling up maps side by side. June 3rd, offshore Eureka. This is the one that made the news because a 5.7 is not a small earthquake. It struck deep and far enough offshore that almost nobody felt it. But the sequence that followed, the 5.1, the 4.5, the string of smaller aftershocks, plus a separate 3.6, felt strongly near Cloverdale the day before. Told you the Mendocino triple junction was working through real accumulated stress. This is the system's job. It does this, but the size and clustering of that particular sequence put it above the noise floor of a normal week on that coastline. And running underneath all of it, Long Valley. This is the one I find the most genuinely fascinating, because it's not loud. There's no dramatic swarm headline attached to it. It's slow, it's quiet, and it's arguably the most significant shift of the year. For decades, the floor of Long Valley caldera has risen and fallen in pulses, up nearly a foot in the early 80s, more through the 90s, adding up to roughly 2.5 feet of total uplift since 1978. That's the number you'll see repeated everywhere, and it's real. But over roughly the past couple of years, USGS's own monitoring posts note something quieter. The ground inside the caldera has flipped from uplift to subsidence. It's sinking, not rising, and it's doing it while staying seismically calm, which USGS itself says is important to document carefully, because a shift like that, even one that looks like it's pointing away from unrest, still represents a real change in the state of the system. And this is where I have to slow down and get technical with you, because the mechanism actually matters. Here's the plain language version of something scientists have spent years arguing about at Long Valley. When the ground swells up like that, is it magma pushing toward the surface, or is it something else? For a long time, the leading theory was straightforward. Magma rising into the upper crust, physically inflating the ground above it like a balloon. That's the scary version, the one that gets clipped into doomsday content. But newer research, using something called distributed acoustic sensing, basically turning 100 kilometers of fiber optic cable running through the caldera into one giant continuous seismic sensor, found something more specific. The imaging shows a clear separation between the shallow hydrothermal system near the surface and the actual magma chamber, which sits about 12 kilometers down. And what's driving most of the recent uplift in seismicity isn't magma physically rising toward the surface. It's fluid, water and gas, chemically exsolved out of the magma, the same way carbonation comes out of a soda when you crack the can, migrating upward through old fault networks and moat structures, and pressurizing the rock above it. That distinction matters enormously. Fluid-driven unrest and magma-driven unrest are not the same hazard, and they don't point toward the same outcome. A caldera can breathe, swell and relax, swell and relax. For decades on fluid movement alone without that meaning an eruption is coming. That's most likely what we've been watching at Long Valley for almost 50 years. The recent flip to subsidence fits inside that same breathing pattern. It's not necessarily the system winding down. It could just as easily be the pressure redistributing into a different part of the plumbing, which is exactly why USGS bothered running their most extensive geodetic survey of the caldera since the late 1990s, just to nail down what's actually happening centimeter by centimeter. Now let's do the same thing for the swarms, because tectonic swarms and volcanic swarms get grouped together by casual observers, and they are not the same animal. A tectonic swarm, like San Ramon, like most of what's happening offshore near Eureka, is stress on a fault relieving itself in a cluster of small to moderate quakes instead of one big rupture. No fluid movement required, no magma anywhere nearby. Just rock grinding against rock in a way that doesn't concentrate into a single main shock. A volcanic or hydrothermal swarm, like the recurring activity at the geysers, or historically at Lassen, happens because fluid or gas is physically moving through cracks in the rock, and that movement itself generates small earthquakes as it forces its way through. USGS scientists actually gave the public a simple diagnostic for telling these apart. Is the swarm sitting near an active volcano or geothermal system? If it's nowhere near one, like San Ramon, it's almost certainly tectonic. If it's sitting right on top of one, like the geysers, you're watching fluid movement, and that's a completely normal near-daily occurrence in that specific location. So when you put the whole sequence side by side, San Ramon tectonic, geysers hydrothermal, Eureka tectonic, Long Valley fluid-driven caldera unrest, you're not looking at one unified event. You're looking at 4 different mechanisms in 4 different corners of the same region, all becoming newsworthy in the same calendar year. That's not proof they're connected. Regional stress fields can and do shift in ways that nudge multiple systems at once without any single system, while causing the others. But it's also not nothing, and it's exactly the kind of pattern that earns sustained attention instead of a one-day headline. As of this week's California Volcano Observatory update, every monitored volcano in the state, Shasta, Lassen, Long Valley, Clear Lake, Medicine Lake, all of it, sits at normal alert level, green aviation color code. The geysers logged 82 earthquakes greater than magnitude 1 over the last reporting week, biggest one, a 2.8. That is genuinely an ordinary week for that field. No red flags, no elevated alerts anywhere in the state. I want that to land clearly, because it's the responsible headline. Even if it's the boring one, nothing currently on the board says an eruption or a major rupture is imminent. What's changed isn't the alert level. What's changed is the texture of activity across the region. More swarms, more clustering, more geodetic movement worth flagging, in more places, over a shorter stretch of months than has been typical. And that's really the core thing I want you to walk away with today. Preparedness isn't about waiting for the alert level to go red. By the time an alert level changes, you're already reacting instead of preparing. The entire value of watching a sequence like this one, and the way I'd watch a multi-day severe weather setup build across the plains, is catching the pattern while it's still background noise to everybody else, so you're not starting from zero if it ever does become something more. This is the part I care about most, because information without action is just anxiety with extra steps. If you live anywhere in this footprint, the Bay Area, the North Coast, the Sacramento Valley, up through Redding and into the shadow of Shasta, or east across the Sierra toward Mammoth, here's what actually matters, and none of it requires you to panic. Know your specific hazard, not the general one. If you're in the Bay Area, your risk is tectonic, sudden short-duration shaking with little to no warning. If you're near the geysers or Clear Lake, your risk profile includes both earthquake shaking and, in a worst case, localized hydrothermal or volcanic hazards. If you're anywhere near Mammoth Lakes or inside the Long Valley footprint, you're living inside an active caldera, and your evacuation routes should already be something you've thought through, not something you figure out during an emergency. Build the kit before you need it. Water, a way to purify more, food that doesn't need cooking, a hand crank or battery radio, flashlights, a first aid kit, medications, copies of important documents. 72 hours minimum, ideally longer, because after a significant regional event, help is not arriving on your timeline. It's arriving on the timeline of everyone else's needs too. Have a family communication plan that doesn't depend on cell towers. Landlines and text messages tend to survive network overload better than phone calls. Pick an out-of-area contact everyone checks in with if local lines are jammed. And if you're near any of these active zones specifically, geysers, Clear Lake, Long Valley, actually learn where the evacuation routes are before you need them. Not generally, specifically. Know which road out of your town is the one you'd actually take, and have a backup, because in mountain terrain there is sometimes only one way out, and everyone else will be trying to use it at the same time you are. None of that is dramatic. None of it requires you to believe a supervolcano is about to erupt. It's the same logic. As keeping a no-AA weather radio charged during severe weather season, you do it because the cost of being ready is nothing, and the cost of not being ready on the one day it actually matters is everything. Here's what I'm going to be personally tracking over the next several weeks, and I'd encourage you to bookmark the same sources I'm using, because this isn't a one-video story. It's a pattern I plan to keep coming back to. I'm watching the weekly Covelo reports for any change out of normal or green at Shasta, Lassen, or Long Valley specifically. That's the first real trigger point, and it would be the actual story if it happens. I'm watching the GPS and INSAR deformation data at Long Valley for whether that uplift to subsidence flip continues, stalls, or reverses again. Because a system that's been breathing in and out for 50 years doing it again isn't news, but a genuinely new pattern would be. I'm watching the Mendocino triple junction for whether this June sequence was a standalone release or the front edge of something building. Triple junctions don't always announce themselves cleanly, and aftershock sequences there can run for weeks. And I'm watching whether the geysers' swarm activity stays inside its normal daily to weekly range, or starts clustering the way it briefly did back in March. I'll be back with an update the moment any of that changes, in a way that actually matters. Not because I want to manufacture urgency out of a quiet week, but because that's the deal I want to have with you. I'm not here to scare you into watching. I'm here to actually tell you when something is different, and stay quiet when it isn't. Look, Northern California has always sat on top of this. The triple junction, the geothermal field, the volcanic arc, the caldera, none of that is new. What's new is that in the same handful of months in the summer of 2026, all 4 of those systems put something on the board at roughly the same time. That's rare enough to pay attention to, and common enough that it doesn't require you to lose sleep over it. Get your kit together this week if you haven't. Know your route out, talk to your family about the plan, and then go back to your life, because that's actually the point of preparedness. It's not there so you can live scared. It's there so you don't have to. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, tell me in the comments what region you're watching, because I read every one of them, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. I'll see you in the next one, and I'll be watching the data in the meantime so you don't have to.